Thank you very much, Chair, for that introduction, and I'm very pleased indeed to be following Gary and also to have this opportunity to talk to you on this really particularly challenging question that I've been asked to address. I should say at the outset, I am not a climate scientist, I'm not an agronomist or a soil scientist, I'm an economist. So my interest, the message I want to talk to you about today is not so much about the targets, you've heard a lot about those, but the how-to. How do we get to these targets? How do we put in place a system of incentives which ensures that the targets are reached? As the Chair said, I'm a member of the Climate Change Advisory Council, but my ideas, my talk today is very much my own personal reflections. You will hear, I understand, tomorrow morning from Professor Fitzgerald, who is the chair of the Council. And, our starting position is, of course, the national policy position on climate policy. This has two elements. The first part has to do with decarbonisation of the electricity, the built environment, the transport sectors. The second part is what we're interested in this afternoon, which has two elements. So it says that we should have an approach to carbon neutrality in the agriculture and land use sector, including forestry, which does not compromise capacity for sustainable food production. And I just want to try to interpret, if you like, these two elements in that objective. So first of all, carbon neutrality. And as Gary has explained, agriculture is rather unique. Agriculture, forestry, and land use, so that we're taking that as a sector, in the sense that it is the only sector where we can actually remove carbon from the atmosphere. So most of our activities were adding carbon, but agriculture and land use has this rather unique characteristic. So if we have a target, we can think of achieving that target either by reducing our emissions, so that's one part of the balance sheet, or by increasing our removals, the sort of sink element, the carbon sequestration that Gary was mentioning. And then how can we sort of interpret this? Well, one obvious way is to sort of take the sources of emissions. So this is the methane from the livestock, it's the manure management, and it's the emissions from agricultural soil. So these are the emissions. And then we can offset that to some extent by either growing more trees, forestry, or by sequestering carbon in the soil. So that sort of balance, it means that we need to be careful whether we're looking at the gross emissions from the sector, which is just the top of the diagram, or the net emissions, which also takes into account the sink or the sequestration effects. Some people argue we should take a broader view of carbon neutrality. We should also take into account the energy linkages, insofar as farmers, for example, are able to grow renewable energy crops, produce biomethane, other sources of bioenergy, which can substitute for fossil fuel and fossil fuel emissions in other sectors. The forest sector can also provide timber, which can be used, what we call harvested wood products. So if that goes into construction, that timber is not burned. It's sort of, the carbon is stored there for quite long periods of time. So again, these are offsets. Of course, if you were taking energy into account, we would also need to take into account the direct use of energy in the agricultural sector. And I suppose my only point here is that carbon neutrality is set out, or an approach to carbon neutrality is set out in the national policy position, but it's actually not really defined anywhere. So that would be an important thing to do if we want to work out how successful we are in achieving that objective. So is an approach to carbon neutrality taking a leadership position? And I would argue, yes, it is, provided that we work on both sides of that balance sheet, sources as well as sinks at the same time. And Teagasc have done some interesting work here to try to sort of estimate what is the potential for offsetting those agricultural emissions over the coming decades from these sinks. And the sinks, we need to be aware of two things. Gary mentioned one of them, which is the sort of impermanence of sinks. So you can store carbon in soil, but if the farmer goes and plows it up the next year, then that carbon is released. So that's different to moving from a diesel car to an electric car, which is a sort of a permanent shift. And the other thing about the offsets, the carbon sequestration, is that you can reach saturation levels. So if you think of a forest and you plant a new forest, as those young trees are growing, they are sucking a lot of carbon out of the soil. But as that forest becomes more mature, then the additional carbon you sequester it sort of approaches zero. So there are limits to what we can do with sequestration. And that comes through clearly from the Chagas work, which suggests that we may be able to sequester possibly 25, maybe even 35% of the gross emissions from agriculture through this forestry and soil carbon sequestration. But there's still going to be a very substantial sort of net emission gap which has to be closed. So my message would be then that we have to also reduce source emissions if we are to get the curve of net emissions moving downwards. There is just another technical point which you should be aware of, that the degree to which we can use these offsets, these forestry and soil carbon offsets, is restricted at the present time under EU legislation. And that is because at the EU level, they don't want to reduce the incentive for the all-important energy transition. And also because of the difficulties around the measurement of some of these carbon fluxes, carbon flows, which I'll come back to in a moment. So if we are looking then at reducing the sources, the first port of call, as Gary has outlined, is of course to try to improve our emissions efficiency. We can also think of this as reducing the carbon intensity of our agricultural production. Gary has mentioned a number of the ways that research is pointing in this direction: improving grassland management, improving the feed efficiency of livestock, improving the genetics of our livestock herd, improving animal health, and in the tillage sector, greater use of no-till and cover crops. But as I say, if we actually look at the projections into the future, improving efficiency on its own is not going to be enough. And there are sort of two things to bear in mind here. One is that we have, when you improve efficiencies and improve profitability on the farm as a result, of course that makes these activities more attractive. So you have a sort of a rebound effect. Something that you all know from when you insulate your house better and the cost of electricity, you get the efficiency in your energy use. But of course, you use some of that to actually have a more comfortable home. So you don't take all of it in terms of the efficiency saving. And the same thing in agriculture. We have a very good scheme, in my view, the Beef Data and Genomics Program, which is designed to improve the genetic merit of the suckler cow herd. A good scheme in itself, but farmers get paid in order to participate in that scheme. So on the one hand, we're saving emissions over time because of the improved efficiency, but we're also paying farmers to keep those animals, which of course means that we have more animals than we otherwise would have. So you have a rebound effect. But also you have changes in market conditions, and here the most important change in recent years has been this removal of the quota limit on milk production within Europe. And that is something that had been in place since 1984. The use of grassland for milk production is by far the most profitable use of grass in Ireland. So once that quota was removed, then we do see dairy farming expanding. And the cattle farming, the suckler herd and finishing, beginning to drop, but certainly not fast enough to compensate. So what you see in this target really is just First of all, this is what we call the non-ETS emissions. ETS is the emissions trading scheme, so it's the sectors that are not in the emissions trading scheme. I think you've come across this in your previous session, but it's essentially agriculture, transport, buildings, and small industries. And that's where we're going to have a target at EU level for our non-ETS emissions. And these are the EPA projections to 2035. You can see the dip here because of the recession, and then you can see that our emissions are recovering because of economic growth, and indeed even with additional measures. This sort of terminology here is that, even taking into account measures that are not in place currently, but which the government is thinking about, we are still going to see an overall increase in emissions on current sort of business as usual scenarios. So that's the overall ceiling. This is the share of agriculture. And yes, agriculture has 33% of our national emissions, but it has almost 45%, almost half of the emissions from those sectors where we're going to have an EU binding target. So when you look at the projections, you can see that essentially agricultural emissions, these are the gross emissions before we take into account any offsets from the forestry, the soil carbon, the land use sector. You can see that agricultural emissions are projected to flatline. Basically, they're going to stay more or less the same. And yet we have this target, haven't quite finally been decided yet, but it seems it will be about a 30% reduction. This is where we need to get to. And the problem is that if somehow we don't tackle the agricultural emissions, then it puts the burden of reaching that target on the other sectors, which has consequences for how efficiently we meet our targets. So this insight really is sort of focusing attention on the idea, should we really be limiting in some way the volume of agricultural output in order to achieve these emission targets? And that is a hugely controversial question. And I could see that looking at the submissions which were made to the Assembly on the website. So you have those, on the one hand, who argue that climate policy must not hinder emission-efficient food produced in Ireland. And this view emphasizes the fact that Ireland produces beef and dairy products with a low carbon footprint for these products. If Ireland didn't produce this milk and beef, this production would move to other countries, perhaps that have higher emissions intensity, and as a result, the global level of emissions would increase, even though we were trying to do our bit by reducing emissions here in Ireland. And the implication of this first view, sorry, I beg your pardon, I seem to have moved on by accident. The implications of this first view is that apart from pursuing options to reduce emissions intensity that are anyway in farmers' own interests, that are profitable or at least cost neutral, agriculture cannot be asked to do more to reduce emissions. And the other view, also strongly expressed in some of the submissions to the Assembly, was that since agriculture is a main emitter of greenhouse gases, it is essential not to expand the national herd. And even some going further and saying we must reduce it and use our land for other uses. And it seems to me these opposing positions are a good example of the trade-offs which you, as the Citizens' Assembly, have got to consider. Because on the one hand, agricultural production underpins livelihoods on thousands of farm holdings across the country. We're good at growing grass because of our climate and farm sizes, as Gary has explained. Farmers find it difficult to profitably grow crops and vegetables except in selected parts of the country. So my own view to sort of try to how to move forward between these competing views is that we should not privilege agricultural emissions by, in some sense, exempting them from disciplines that apply to all other sectors. But of course, nor should we penalize agricultural emissions, where it's clear that the economic value added per unit of emissions in agricultural activity is higher than the economic value added in other sectors. So the sensible approach is to try to make the emissions reduction in the most cost-effective way, regardless of where that might be. And the problem is that the costs caused by the greenhouse gas emissions associated with agricultural production are not taken into account by farmers when deciding how much to produce. And in my view, that's not right. So the most practical way to sort of send a signal to reflect that cost is through some kind of charge or levy or tax on carbon emissions, which of course should be the same across the whole economy. But conversely, if a farm is sequestering carbon, if we're actually pulling the carbon out of the atmosphere, farmers should get rewarded for that activity because it has equal value. So when a dairy farmer, for example, is deciding how much milk to produce, they look at the costs of doing so, the fertilizer, the animal feed, the veterinary medicines, the milking parlour and so on. They look at the price they get. And then on the basis of that comparison, they decide, how much milk is it worth my while to produce. At the moment, the costs of emitting the greenhouse gases associated with that are not taken into account in the farmer's decision making. And that's really the message that I want to get across. It seems to me that climate leadership would start by ensuring that farmers get the appropriate signals, either to reduce emissions or to increase sequestration. So this isn't, I want to make clear, a question of sort of penalising agriculture or farmers. Ireland is currently one of a minority of countries that has introduced a carbon tax. At the moment, the tax covers emissions on energy use in the non-ETS sector, while emissions inside the emissions trading scheme, these are the large power companies and industries, they need to purchase permits or allowances. So they all face some kind of signal that emitting carbon has a cost and we want to try to reduce it. If agricultural emissions are subject to a looser discipline than emissions in other sectors, then the costs of making that transition to a low-carbon society will be even higher for those other sectors. In fact, if we fail to meet our climate targets under the EU directive, which is currently the targets currently being set in Brussels, then of course we do have the option to purchase those emissions, those allowances from other countries. But if we're doing that because we have, in a sense, not reflected the appropriate carbon price to our farmers, so agriculture is expanding, as a result we are exceeding our targets, and therefore we have to buy these allowances, that's a cost to the taxpayer, and in a sense it's an indirect subsidy to the agricultural sector. In my view, that's not what we should mean by sustainable food production. So it's not only a question of efficiency, but a question of fairness, that the same rules should apply across the board. And of course, as I say, that use of this sort of pricing principle must work both ways. So farmers and land managers who find ways of sequestering additional carbon should be rewarded for this. And we do have that in our forestry policy at the moment. We do heavily support forest, the planting of additional forests. Landowners can get the full cost of the planting covered through a planting grant. You can get a forest premium for 15 years, which is an annual amount, which is tax-free. And at the end of when your timber is ready for felling, after 30, 35 years, that timber proceeds are also tax-free. So we do give very significant support on the sequestration side. And I wouldn't advocate that we actually go further in subsidizing forestry. I think the subsidies are there, although I think we could restructure them to actually emphasize that what we are paying for is the value of the carbon sequestration as such. So, as I say, we need to look at both sides of the balance sheet. Now, we should be aware, and you should be aware in sort of thinking about this, that there are two big objections to what I've just advocated. And the first is it practical? And there are great practical difficulties to applying what I call a sort of a carbon price signal, either a tax or a subsidy, in agricultural production. Because it's not like running a machine where you have a fixed amount of fuel usage and you can easily measure what is the carbon content of that fuel. Measuring the carbon stock in fields, it's a question of the weather at a particular point in time. It's a question of the system that is used to raise the animals on those fields. And if we were to do it at a farm level, there would be very high monitoring and transactions costs. So if we're thinking about this, it's most likely that at least initially we would begin by applying these charges at the processor level to minimize those costs. The other sort of objection which you need to take into account is that such a carbon charge might reduce the competitiveness of Irish agricultural producers and lead to what we emphasized earlier as carbon leakage. I suppose if you think about improvements that have taken place over time in the way we produce our food, for example, the phasing out of dangerous pesticides, or improvements in animal welfare in confined animal systems, broiler chickens and eggs and so on. Somebody had to take the first move. Somebody had to be the leader, knowing that others would be willing and able to follow. So I'm not suggesting that we go way out in front, but I am suggesting that we shouldn't be afraid of being a first mover in this area. Whether, of course, global emissions would increase if we were to impose this sort of explicit cost of emissions on Irish farmers. It would depend on where the additional food, beef, if we're thinking of it here, would be produced and under what conditions. So, it's not a given that would be the outcome. Of course, international coordination is the way forward to address this issue, because if all countries were doing this simultaneously, we wouldn't worry about competitiveness. And that is precisely the objective of the Paris Agreement. It has these regular stock-taking exercises every 5 years where countries should raise their levels of ambition. So, okay, maybe we would be the first, but we can certainly set an example and try to ensure that other countries would follow as part of this. And also within the European Union, we would have the ability to try to influence the rules and regulations. But I do accept that these initiatives will take time, and there are ways in which we can try to avoid some of these adverse competitiveness effects if we want to try to send a signal to farmers as to how they should be using their land. We can think of making the charge, but then recycling it back to farmers so that they don't suffer a net income loss. They get the signal, but that could be recycled back either as a subsidy for the carbon, more carbon-friendly production activities, or even as a flat rate payment per hectare. So, coming to my towards the end, what would a sustainable agriculture look like? So, what I'm suggesting is that what we're trying to signal, what we want to achieve, is a movement away from the more carbon-intensive activities, but substituting those with less carbon-intensive activities, or activities that help to sequester carbon. I'm just going to look at two options here. One is the forestry one. I've mentioned that we do provide these generous incentives for planting, but we are not meeting our targets. So the official government position is that we should be planting around 15,000 hectares a year. Gary says we're down to 5. I'd be a little bit more optimistic and say it's about 6,500, but it's still not even half the official planting rate, despite those generous incentives that I have mentioned. And the problem here is, that's just to tell me that my time is up. Sorry about that. The problem here is, of course, that I lost that, put me off the thing. Yes, the problem here is that as well as incentivizing agriculture, forestry, it is competing against these other land uses which are not bearing the sort of true cost of their activity. The other and very controversial area is what might happen particularly to suckler cow numbers. And I just wanted to show you the trend in cow numbers since 1975, more or less since we joined the European Union. And the blue line is the dairy cows, and you can see that because of the dairy quota, we were able to produce our quota of milk with fewer cows. Milk yields were increasing, and then you see the uptick in more recent years as the quota has disappeared. The red line is then the suckler cows, which are kept just for beef production. You can see that actually when we joined the European Union, we had as few as 400,000 at one stage. That increased to 1,200,000, and it has more or less stayed more or less the same at that level since then. And that is surprising because farmers do not make money out of producing beef. If you just look at these figures from the most recent 2 years that the Chagos National Farm Survey has identified, so I've looked at the two enterprises, the single suckling. These are the farms where you have producing the calves, and then the finishing is where you're taking the calves and rearing them, either from calves from the dairy or from the beef herd. And you can see that this is the total gross output. Then you have the direct costs. You have the overhead costs, so this would be the buildings, the tractor, the machinery, and so on for spreading fertilizer. And then this is what the farmer makes at the end of the day. This is what the farmer makes from beef production at the end of the day. Basically, nothing. The farmer is surviving because he or she is receiving payments under the Common Agricultural Policy, and that is essentially what is their income. You can see that even on the cattle finishing system, it's been negative returns on the last 2 years. And this is not that because these years are exceptional, this has been a standard trend over many years. So my argument would be that sending a signal that, look, if we properly cost these activities, it would raise the costs, that is true, but farmers in these activities would not actually lose income, because all of their income is coming from the payments, and the payments are not related to the fact that they're keeping cattle. They would still be able to receive these payments even if they turn their land to other uses. So my final slide, I'm sorry for going on a little bit long, Chair, is simply to say that what I'm advocating, and you should be aware of that, I'm quite upfront, no country has yet moved in this direction. Many countries have said they want to reduce agricultural emissions. We all try to do it by raising efficiencies in ways that are profitable to farmers, or by subsidizing change. And of course, subsidies can play a role, particularly for new technologies and to overcome sort of barriers to adoption. But ultimately, we cannot all rely on subsidies, because subsidies means passing the problem on to the taxpayer, and we all know how many other demands there are on the taxpayer. The only other country which came close to doing what I'm suggesting in the past was New Zealand. And New Zealand actually in the mid-2000s introduced legislation which brought agriculture within their emissions trading scheme. They were given some years to before this was to happen, and in 2012 the New Zealand government actually decided to stop that process, to keep agriculture out, because they were worried about the competitive effects. What's interesting, those of you who follow New Zealand politics, my brother lives down there, so I do a little bit, but they've just had an election with a new prime minister who has promised to go back to the original, to bring back agriculture into the emissions trading scheme, which is another way of doing what I am proposing. So, no country has yet done it, but it is certainly being discussed. Of course, as Gary mentioned, global action is required also on the demand side, the food waste, and moves towards less meat-intensive diets. I support that, but I just point out that for Ireland, these issues don't help us that much to address our emissions because of the export nature of our production. So even if we in Ireland were to considerably improve our performance, it wouldn't dramatically help to reduce our emissions. Irish agriculture is going to face considerable challenges in the coming 3 or 4 years. Brexit is going to cause problems. There will be changes in the cap, maybe some reduction in the payments that farmers are receiving. So we do need to be careful about how we would phase in any changes and do so in full awareness of the consequences. But my message to you is that unless we do this, unless we seriously attempt to get that curve of agricultural emissions, not just flatlining, but moving down, we are not really seriously talking about a position of climate leadership. And that's your decision to take. Thank you.